We must now revert once more to the endings. Their importance will have become evident to the student who has taken the trouble to study my game with Janowski. Example 53. After an uneventful opening, a Roy Lopez, in one of its normal variations, my opponent suddenly made things interesting by offering the exchange, an offer which, of course, I accepted. Then followed a very hard, arduous struggle in which I had to defend myself against a very dangerous attack made possible by the excellent maneuvering of my adversary. Finally, there came the time when I could give back the material and change off most of the pieces, and come to an ending in which I clearly had the advantage. But yet, the ending itself was not as simple as it at first appeared, and finally, perhaps through one weak move on my part, it became a very difficult matter to find a win. Had I been a weak endgame player, the game would probably have ended in a draw, and all my previous efforts would have been in vain. Unfortunately, that is very often the case among the large majority of players. They are weak in the endings, a failing from which masters of the first rank are at times not free. Incidentally, I might call attention to the fact that all the world's champions of the last 60 years have been exceedingly strong in the endings. Morphy, Steinitz, and Dr. Lasker had no superiors in this department of the game while they held their titles. I have previously stated, when speaking about general theory, that at times the way to win consists in attacking first on one side, then, granted greater mobility of the pieces, to transfer the attack quickly from one side to the other, breaking through before your opponent has been able to bring up sufficient forces to withstand the attack. This principle of the middle game can sometimes be applied in the endings in somewhat similar manner. In the above position, I, with the black pieces, played rook to e4, check. The idea, as will be seen very soon, is to play pawn to h4 in order to fix white's king-side pawns with a view to the future. It is evident to black that white wants to bring his king to b3 to support his two weak isolated pawns, and thus to free his rooks. Black, therefore, makes a plan to shift the attack to the king's side at the proper time in order to obtain some advantage from the greater mobility of his rooks. The d-file rook to a5 in order to force the rook to rook square, keeping both rooks tied up. Black begins to transfer his attack to the king's side. Rook to g1, a serious mistake which loses quickly. White should have played king to b3, when black would have answered the a-file rook to a5, pawn to f3, and black would have obtained an opening at g3 for his king, which in the end might give him the victory. Now the king cannot go to b3 because of rook to b5, check. King to e2. If the g-pawn takes f3, rook takes g1, followed by rook to h1, winning. Rook takes h3, and black won after a few moves. Another good example, in which is shown the advantage of the greater mobility of the pieces in an ending, is the following from a game Capablanca-Kupchick played at the Havana Masters Tournament, 1913. The full score and notes of the game can be found in the book of the tournament. White's only advantage in the above position is that he possesses the open file and has the move which will secure him the initiative. There is also the slight advantage of having his pawns on the queen's side united, while black has an isolated queen's rook pawn. The proper course, as in the previous ending, is to bring the rooks forward, so that at least one of them may be able to shift from one side of the board to the other, and thus keep black's rooks from moving freely. What this means in general theory has been stated already. It really means keep harassing the enemy, force him to use his big pieces to defend pawns. If he has a weak point, try to make it weaker, or create another weakness somewhere else, and his position will collapse sooner or later. If he has a weakness and he can get rid of it, make sure that you create another weakness somewhere else. From the position in question, the game continued thus: rook to e4, the f-file rook to e8, with the object of repeating white's maneuver, and also not to allow white the control of the open file. King to f8. Black wants to bring his king to the center of the board in order to be nearer to whatever point white decides to attack. The move is justified, at least on the general rule, that in such endings the king should be in the middle of the board. He does nothing after all but follow white's footsteps. Besides, it is hard to point out anything better. If pawn to d5, rook to g4, check, followed by king to e2, would leave black in a very disagreeable position. If pawn to f5, rook to a4, winning the queen's rook-pawn, which would practically leave white with a passed pawn ahead on the queen's side, as the 3 pawns of black on the king's side would be held by the 2 of white. The student should note that through the same maneuver, black is forced into a position similar to the one shown in the previous ending. This move has a manifold object. It practically fixes all of black's pawns except the queen's pawn, which is the only one that can advance 2 squares. It specially prevents the advance of black's king's bishop pawns, and at the same time threatens the advance of white's king's bishop pawns to f4 and f5. By this threat, it practically forces black to play pawn to d5, which is all white desires, for reasons that will soon become evident. King to d6. Evidently forced, as the only other move to save a pawn would have been the d-pawn takes c4, which would have left all black's pawns isolated and weak. If pawn to d4, rook to a6, and black's game is hopeless. Apparently very strong, since it forces the exchange of rooks because of the threat rook to h6, but in reality it leads to nothing. The best chance was to play rook to g8. Up to now white had played with finesse, but this last move is weak. Rook to a6 was the proper way to continue, so as to force black to give up his queen's rook pawn or queen's bishop pawn. King to d2. Again a bad move. Rook to a3 was the proper continuation, and if then rook to b8, rook to b3, with excellent winning chances. In fact, I believe, a won game. King to b7. Black misses his only chance. Rook to b8 would have drawn. He goes back with the king to support his king's pawn, and thus be able to utilize his rook. It is, however, useless, and only white's weak play later on gives him further chances of a draw. To prevent the black rook from controlling the open file, king to d7. He must keep his king on that side, because white threatens to march with his king to a6 via b4. He can do nothing but wait for white. The text move stops white from moving his rook, but only for one move. Rook to f6. The only other move was king to a7, when white could play rook to g7 or even pawn to b5. A weak move which gives black a fighting chance. In this ending, as is often the case with most players, white plays the best moves whenever the situation is difficult and requires careful handling, but once his position seems to be overwhelming, he relaxes his efforts, and the result is nothing to be proud of. The right move was rook to g7. Rook takes f2. Black misses his last chance. Rook to b2 check, forcing the king to c3, in order to avoid the perpetual, would probably draw. The reader must bear in mind that my opponent was then a very young and inexperienced player, and consequently deserves a great deal of credit for the fight he put up. Rook takes f4, rook to b2 check, followed by rook to h2 offered better chances. Black resigns. This ending shows how easy it is to make weak moves, and how often, even in master play, mistakes are made and opportunities are lost. It shows that, so long as there is no great advantage of material, even with a good position, a player, no matter how strong, cannot afford to relax his attention even for one move. A good proof of the previous statement is shown in the following ending between Marshall and Kupchick in one of their 2 games in the same tournament, Havana, 1913. It is evident that Marshall, white, is under great difficulties in the above position. Not only is he bound to lose a pawn, but his position is rather poor. The best he could hope for was a draw, unless something altogether unexpected happened, as it did. No reason can be given for Black's loss of the game, except that he felt so certain of having the best of it, with a pawn more, and what he considered a safe position, that he became exceedingly careless and did not consider the danger that actually existed. Let us see how it happened. Rook takes a2. The mistakes begin. This is the first. Black sees that he can take a pawn without any danger and does not stop to think whether there is anything better. Rook to f2 check was the right move. If then king to g3, rook takes a2. If instead white played king to e4, then rook to e5, check followed by rook takes a2. Mistake number 2, and this time such a serious one as to almost lose the game. The proper move was to play pawn to f5 in order to break up white's pawns, and at the same time make room for the black king, which is actually in danger, as will soon be seen. The a-file rook to a5. Mistake number 3, and this time fatal. His best move was the g-file rook to a5. After the text move, there is no defense. Black's game is lost. This shows that even an apparently simple ending has to be played with care. From a practically won position, Black finds himself with a lost game, and it has only taken 3 moves. Rook to g7. If pawn to f5, rook takes g6 and wins easily. Black resigns. The reason is evident. If king to g6, the reader has probably realized by this time that endings of two rooks and pawns are very difficult, and that the same holds true for endings of one rook and pawns. Endings of two rooks and pawns are not very common in actual play, but endings of one rook and pawns are about the most common sort of endings arising on the chessboard. Yet though they do occur so often, few have mastered them thoroughly. They are often of a very difficult nature, and sometimes, while apparently very simple, they are in reality extremely intricate. Here is an example from a game between Marshall and Rosenthal in the Manhattan Chess Club Championship Tournament of 1909-1910. In this position, Marshall had a simple win by rook to c7, check, but played pawn to f6, and thereby gave Black a chance to draw. Luckily for him, Black did not see the drawing move, played poorly, and lost. Had Black been up to the situation, he would have drawn by playing rook to d6. Now White has two continuations, either pawn to f7 or rook to c7, check. King to c4, and White will finally have to sacrifice the rook for Black's pawn. Or rook to c7, check. Rook to g6, check, a very important move, as against rook to f6. Rook to e7 wins. King to c3, and White will finally have to sacrifice the rook for the pawn, or draw by perpetual check. If there were nothing more in the ending, it would not be of any great value. But there are other very interesting features. Black did not realize that rook to d8 was the only move to draw. Now there would be two other moves to try, either rook to g6, check, or rook to f6. Let us examine them. Rook to e6, check. If pawn to b3, rook to h5 check wins, because if the king goes back, then rook to h6, and if the king goes up, then rook to h4 check, followed by rook to f4 wins. Rook to f6. If rook to d6, check, king to e4 wins. Rook to h6 wins. Pawn to f7. King to c4. If pawn to b3, rook to g3, and White will either capture the pawn or go to f3 and come out with a winning ending. Rook to g3, and White will either capture the pawn or play rook to f3, according to the circumstances, and come out with a winning ending. Black did not realize that king to d4 was the only move to draw. Now the best continuation would be pawn to f7. White threatened to check with the rook at e6. Pawn to b3. If king to c4, both pawn to h4 and king to e3 will win. The last named move particularly would win with ease. This position we have arrived at is won by White, because there are two files between the opposing king and the pawn from which the king is cut off by the rook, and besides, the pawn can advance to the fourth rank before the opponent's rook can begin to check on the file. This last condition is very important, because if, instead of the position on the diagram, the black rook were at h8 and black had the move, he could draw by preventing the advance of the pawn, either through constant checks or by playing rook to f8 at the proper time. Now that we have explained the reasons why this position is won, we leave it to the student to work out the correct solution. The fact that out of one apparently simple ending, we have been able to work out several most unusual and difficult endings should be sufficient to impress upon the student's mind the necessity of becoming well acquainted with all kinds of endings, and especially with endings of rook and pawns.